So kind of the uh, extension of this, so we've covered some famous data sets, why data sets are important, why you should hopefully be interested in making data sets, and kind of now what makes a good data set. So sort of from a very sort of easy starting point, lots of images. So sort of the bigger your data set can be, the better. Obviously, the question comes in with sort of quality versus quantity. Is having a few really well labeled images better than having millions of really poorly labeled images? And it depends a lot on the problem, but ultimately, if you can have a larger data set, your problem's going to be easier and you're going to enable more techniques and better results when you're trying to solve a problem. And this is sort of particularly important if you have a complicated problem or very, very subtle differences that you're trying to identify. So if your problem is, I'm looking for, this brain tumor data set that we had, was it brats? It's not necessarily an easy problem, but I can look at this image and pretty easily tell you where the boundary of the tumor is in about half a second. I don't know anything about brain tumors or radiology, but I can look at that image and say, that white thing looks kind of suspicious. I could draw a box around that. And so, of course, for a problem like that, maybe you don't need as many data sets, but if your problem is differentiating between sort of exactly where the boundary between, some of these like more subtle regions are, then it becomes much more difficult, where you're not going to have sort of, okay, if it's bright, it's part of the tumor, and if it's not bright, then it isn't. But you have sort of, this is what texture we expect. There are lots of artifacts, but if you can ignore the artifacts and do this, that's the kind of task that becomes much more difficult and requires much more data. So sort of lots of diversity. This is important that your data represents really well what you expect to see sort of in the wild. And so in the wild is, of course, a very different phrase depending on what sort of project you're doing. So if you're making a self-driving car, in the wild means what do you expect a car to actually see on the road? And if you're a scientist, in the wild could mean, what do you expect another group with a similar microscope to have for data? You don't want to have all your images taken with exactly the same microscope with exactly the same settings. Otherwise, if someone builds an algorithm that works really well for what you did, it's unlikely that that would work well on a slightly different microscope with slightly different settings. And so you don't want to build something that's too specific to exactly what setup you have. Lots of different scanners, reconstruction algorithms, noise, illumination types, rotation, colors. So kind of what are the standard things you expect to see? Is the alignment of the image, is it always going to be in the center? Is it sometimes going to be sort of rotated or closer to the edge? And how can you sort of make sure your data set accounts for a lot of those standard transformations? And so, it obviously doesn't have to be kind of absurd. You don't have, if you never expect your image to be upside down, you don't need to have a data set with some of the images upside down, because you can anticipate that people try to use your data set and build algorithms correctly. But if you're dealing with something where, that's in a hospital where people manually load a, film X-ray onto a scanner, then it's very common that they put it on the scanner upside down or backwards or flipped around. And so you'd want your data set to include that. Many examples from different categories, and this is usually the most difficult part. So if you're building a breast cancer algorithm and you only have one male with breast cancer and thousands of females with breast cancer, then it becomes very hard to generalize what male breast cancer looks like. If you only have one male with breast cancer, how can you build an algorithm using that and be sure that that algorithm will work on other males? Similarly, if you're building an algorithm for older patients, because sort of, women live longer than men, you wouldn't want your algorithm to sort of be overly biased that just because the person's a woman, they're going to be living longer. And so how can you make sure these groups are sort of diverse? Meaningful labels. So this is where it becomes sort of very, very important to focus on and understand your task well. And this is sort of a clear task or question. And for most of you, this probably sounds almost overly simplified. That, like, of course, your task is clear. This shouldn't be a difficult problem to solve at all. But usually, it's actually not the case. So I think, has everyone seen CAPTCHAs from Google before? Or familiar with them? Is anyone not familiar with them? So it's when you're filling out a form on Google and you have to, they're very annoying, but basically when you're filling out a form, you get some sort of image like this. Is a godless creation of evil. So lots of people seem to think this is very annoying. Can I just get the image? So here, click on squares with vehicles is sort of a fairly simple task. But trying to do that well, does this square have a vehicle in it or not? It has part of a wheel in it, but it's really at the edge. Or does this one, it has just the top in it? Does that count as having a vehicle in it? Or does it need to be more than half filled with a vehicle? Because if I were doing this, I would probably skip this one and this one, but someone else might click them. And so if you're trying to make a data set and label it well, you need to have tasks that are very, very clearly defined so that people will give the same answer to the same question. So ideally the same person, ideally everyone would give the same answer, but at the very least, the same person doing the question multiple times would give the same answer. And particularly with things like this, if there's a large sign, but there's a vehicle behind it because you can see in other tiles that a vehicle is there, does that count as a tile with a vehicle in it? And that's not a simple question to answer. And so for even a very trivial task, you could give this to a kindergartner, click on the boxes with vehicles, it still is a quite complicated problem because, knowing that there's a vehicle there doesn't necessarily, is that what the question's asking? Or is the question, do you see lots of pixels from a vehicle? Or they have lots of images where the illumination isn't constant. And so, it gets very dark, but you see the top of a vehicle, so you can assume the bottom is probably there. And labeling these images is quite important for Google. They're trying to, build self-driving cars or something like that. And they have lots and lots of images from Street View that they need to label. But the task here isn't very well defined. And this is also what makes it very frustrating because you might do this 4 or 5 times and have Google tell you your results aren't correct or I think you're a robot or whatever else. And, it's a poorly defined task. And so, this is just with a simple image. With really complicated medical images, it obviously gets much more difficult. Where exactly is the border of this tumor? Or, where is sort of this, is this part here part of the screen, or is it part of the blue, or is it part of something else? And if you gave this image to 5 different physicians, would they all mark the same thing? And the answer to that is usually no, but how can you define the instructions and the task to minimize that problem? Because if every single time someone does your task, they do it differently, it makes it really difficult for you to try to build something on top of it. Deep learning or any type of approach, because any algorithm you build is going to give the same answer every time. And if your data has different answers every time, it's going to be very tricky. So that's really where sort of the unambiguous, able to be derived from the image alone. And so, without knowing, is this an image of a parking lot or there's other information that's not available there? Quantitative is quite important and sort of non-obvious. So for, if you have thousands of images of brain and every single time the tumor is sort of that bright region on the side, marking the boundaries of it probably isn't a very useful label because you could just do that by taking all the bright pixels. And so you want to have labels that are actually things that are difficult for an algorithm to do, which isn't always easy to say. But if it's an obvious or very clear, visible thing, a label is probably not going to make a very valuable data set. So now in terms of types of data sets, so again, this sort of starts to get into more the machine learning classes, but we're focusing on this much more of a, what types of problem and being aware of what type of problem you're actually trying to deal with. So the main categories for problems that we have are sort of classification, regression, segmentation, and detection. And so most problems fall into one of these categories, depending on what you're doing, and then there's a few that are very special cases that probably don't fall into any of these categories, and that we'll talk about afterwards. And so classification is what sort of the MNIST data set and the ImageNet were really focused on. So you have an image and you want to put it into a category. And so there's sort of a fixed number of categories. Usually an image can only have exactly one category. There are some problems where images can have multiple, but generally you focus on things with one category. The categories should be non-ordered. So with MNIST, it's potentially slightly a bad system to use because the categories do have an order, but you're worried about identifying the right number, not being as close to the right number as possible. And so it's then a slightly different task. But examples of sort of cat versus dog, cancer versus healthy, you can have 2 categories or thousands of categories. It's still sort of fundamentally a classification problem. And so with MNIST, this is, you have an image, and with each image, the associated label is a category. And so that's exactly what you're trying to produce from it. So regression is where you take an image or whatever your input happens to be, and you try to predict one or more sort of decimal values out of it. And so, an example kind of value of houses from picture taken by owner. So if you have a house website like Zillow and you want to take the pictures and automatically estimate how much the house should cost, or if you want to take pictures from Airbnb apartments and then decide which price category they belong into, that would be sort of a regression problem. Risk of hurricane from a satellite image, risk of forest fire, all of those things where you're coming up with a number. And the number kind of, either represents an actual measure of something or a percentage or a probability. That all falls into the regression problem. And so kind of the reason why MNIST isn't really a regression is because you don't want to see 7.5 or 6.8. That doesn't really mean anything to you. That it's closer to 6 than 7, those digits are all different categories. And so it's not really regression because 7.1 doesn't mean something. Whereas, this example, which is a competition that the Radiological Society of America did last year, was taking x-rays of hands and trying to determine how old the person is. And so, for children, you can look at the x-ray and look at the growth plates and try to determine how old that person is likely to be. And so, for each image, you have a number of months or a number of years that the person is old, and they built this giant data set, and the challenge became, how can you take this and make an algorithm that's able to take this image, find the important features, and predict how old the person is. And so here, you have 100 months, 60 months, 174, 54. And so here the number sort of as a decimal, and it actually means something, that 204 and 204.1 mean something different. And so being able to predict that accurately is quite important. And here you see, this is a very sort of diverse data set. They have lots of different images that are rotated in different ways. Some of them are bright, some of them are dark. And so it's very messy, but it represents, data from, I think, 12 different hospitals labeled by dozens of different doctors, and so the accuracy is quite good. If you're interested, there's links for all of that, so you can go into more detail. Segmentation is then sort of the next one, which we have sort of lectures dedicated to. But this is where you take an image and you're trying to predict, sort of one or more values for each pixel. And so every pixel needs a label. A pixel cannot have multiple labels. And it's typically limited to a few different types of objects. So if you have a segmentation problem with 100 different types of objects, it's probably not segmentation. It's probably more of an object detection. But that's the next one we'll get into. And so this becomes sample problems of where is a tumor in an image of the lungs. So you get an image and you have to find where the tumor is, or where are streets from a satellite image of the neighborhood. And so kind of identifying features, and that's something we'll get into a lot more. But one of the big examples for this was the Kaggle Data Science Bowl last year, which I think got a $100,000 prize. And it was about taking microscope images and automatically finding the nuclei in them. And so here you have your image, and there you have all the different nuclei labeled. Wow, it's really hard to see. I don't know if I can. I guess that's not going to look very good. Can I adjust it? So you see there's lots of different, so each nuclei is labeled slightly differently here. So that's why there's different colors, but that you can see kind of all of the nuclei that are labeled for this image. And so the goal was to, they made a data set where you had thousands and thousands of these images taken on lots of different instruments with lots of different samples, and they manually labeled where all of the nuclei were, because for them, as a lab, I think it was one of the labs at Harvard that was behind it, they wanted to have the ability to take images and automatically extract nuclei well. And so rather than handcrafting sort of one algorithm, they made a big competition out of it so they could have thousands of people take the same data and try to build the best algorithm from it. Sort of object detection is sort of taking an image and predicting which objects appear in it. And what this is it's typically more of a bounding box problem rather than specific pixels. And so you're not making a prediction at each pixel. You're making sort of what regions do objects show up in. And this is then objects that can overlap. You can have hundreds of different categories for each object. And so, one of the examples for this was sort of, opaque regions and X-rays. And so here you have, each different opaque region that shows up as sort of a bounding box in the image. And so this data set's actually an example where it could be a segmentation problem or it could be an object detection problem. But there are plenty of data sets if we go to Open Images, which is one of the Google projects in Zurich. They have a new website where we should be able to find at least one sample. But here is sort of a good object detection example because you have a number of different objects in the same scene and the objects overlap. And so you couldn't really do it as a segmentation problem because you wouldn't want to have some of the pixels labeled human and some of the pixels labeled face overlapping with other pixels labeled clothing or any other categories you might have. And so in this image, you're able to have lots of different very specific categories, and they can overlap, and many of the image's regions can have sort of the same categories associated with it. And so this is where it becomes a much more object detection problem, because your goal isn't just to segment the pixels or to say what every pixel belongs to, but it's to say which sort of regions belong to which objects. And so here they have, hundreds and hundreds of examples here. I don't know why it decided hairspray. There's probably alpaca. So you have alpacas, and then you have plants underneath them, and they have sort of I think, millions of images with lots and lots of different labels on top of them. And so the point is to try to make algorithms that are able to identify all these different elements in the scene without forcing each pixel to belong to a specific category. And as you see for this, the whole image belongs to plant, but the sub sort of categories inside there are shown. And that they have sort of very, very specific labels. And so it's not limited to 20. You can have thousands and thousands of different ones where you have hiking equipment, plants, footwear, hiking equipment. And so this data set you could then use to try to identify people. You could use to try to identify footwear. So if you wanted to identify shoes in images, you could just take the footwear class and use that as your basis. But that making this data sort of allows a lot of different things to use the same data set as a basis. There's sort of unlimited possibilities for what your data set can consist of. So if you go to sort of the more kind of crazy data sets, there's data sets that sort of show the same image more or less with zebras and horses. And so I think they have a cool video for this, where it's kind of paired sequences. Is this it? There's a cool video of it. So it's able to take a video of a horse and turn it into a video of a zebra, because you sort of have these paired sequences between horses and zebras. And so obviously this isn't a zebra in that image, but by training on both sets of images and videos, you're able to apply transformations and turn horses into zebras. CycleGAN also has lots of other applications, winter to summer, different artists or photographs to artists and back, and sort of those standard ones. There's also ones sort of related to the lecture next week with sort of denoising, where, as most of you who have sort of cameras know, if you try to take pictures in the dark, particularly if you don't have the latest, iPhone or Google Pixel, the images often look very, very bad. But if you have a nice DSLR with a big sensor, you can actually take really nice images in the dark. And so what this was sort of a challenge where they collected a huge number of pictures taken with cell phones, and then pictures taken with sort of a high quality DSLR camera. Or actually, they were both with DSLR cameras, but one of them was taken with sort of cell phone settings, so a lot of amplification, and the other one was taken over a really long time so that you have no noise artifacts. And so the goal was to make a model that's able to turn the crappy, low-resolution, noisy image into a much nicer, high-quality image. And this was actually the basis for what Google's now put in their phones, I think Apple as well, where you're able to make image enhancement that gets rid of the noise and the artifacts that come when you take an image at night. And so this data set, allows you to do things like that. There's then similar data sets which allow you to do super resolution, and then many more which do this then just for microscopy. And so here you have data sets. Okay, so there's not any nice pictures for this one, but basically where you have a data set where some of the images are low resolution, and then you have higher resolution versions of the images, and you learn to make models that actually enhance the resolution in an image. And so now for kind of, how does this affect you? How do you go about building your own? It's sort of very time consuming. There's no quick, easy way to get a data set. There usually aren't a lot of great tools because so much of it is very problem specific. If you're working with tomography data from an X-ray device, that's very different than working with pictures from an iPhone, or working with diffraction patterns or atomic force microscopy images. And usually the task you're working on is very specific. The object detection where you're marking sort of bounding boxes is a fairly common task, but a lot of times you're trying to segment tumors in 3D images and transfer the labels across the 4 different modalities that you have, and that then becomes sort of something you'll have to implement yourself. And then in particular, it becomes very problem specific when you're trying to do things quickly. So as you do this more and more, you'll try to speed it up and make it more efficient. And you'll be able to take shortcuts that work for your problem, but then don't work for someone else's. So for sort of the coding-free approach to this, for classification, the very easiest thing you can do is organize your images into folders. And so if you make different folders, in each folder, one folder is called dog, one called cat, one's called something else, that's a way that tools already handle images. And so if you have your images divided up into different folders, that makes it very easy for someone to take those folders and then try to build something that classifies on top of it, or for you to do further processing with that. For regression, obviously, making an Excel table where you have each name of the image. First column's the image, the second column is the value you're trying to get from it or you'd expect to see in it. And then segmentation or object detection is where this becomes sort of most messy. And this is where, Fiji or image J, you can open the image, you can make a copy of it, and then just manually draw the region that you want to save or mark. And that's kind of the easiest or standard approaches for doing that. And so for most tasks, you'll probably want to do something slightly more advanced, but at least as a starting point, you don't have to write any code or use any overly complicated tools to do it. So in terms of what's available beyond that, for classification and segmentation, there's a whole number of tools that are available. So classification is one of the easiest problems because it's very common and the results are sort of always similar. One of the more interesting projects for this is something called Brainder, which is Tinder for brains, where you can take images. I think you have to sign up. Can you just play without? I guess you can, yeah. So basically you have to say if the image is too noisy or not, and you just swipe left or swipe right to say if that image is noisy, and then you help this group label their data set as noisy or non-noisy images so that they can do other things. I guess for whatever reason it's not working, but that you see the idea behind it, that you can kind of go through images fairly quickly. You make this website and then you can give it to all of your colleagues and they can then help you label your data set more quickly. And so if it's a simple classification problem where it's sort of pass-fail, that's a fairly easy thing to do and the whole thing's open source. And so if you're interested, you can easily make a copy of it and replace their images with your images and have sort of a nice labeling solution for your tools. There's these tools from sort of Labelbox, LabelMe, some tools that do sort of active learning, which then allow you to kind of train models interactively. And so rather than just randomly giving you new images, it gives you images that a model has the hardest time identifying. And so I think here we can see hopefully an example of that. Where you label these images in different categories based on what data you're looking at. And that you can then click this retrain button and it will in the background retrain a model with the labels you've given it in order to choose images that it has the most difficulty identifying. And so rather than collecting all of your data and then building a model, you can use a model to help make your collection more efficient so that you focus on data that are sort of more difficult rather than just easy, simple data sets. And so this is a sort of one of the possible tools that you can use. There's a lot of others that we mentioned. And then there's, of course, whole collections of commercial tools that are available. Figure 8 and Spare 5. So Spare 5 actually has like an app you can put on your phone where you can earn money labeling images for companies in your free time. Another sort of approach that you can take is sort of simulations. And so depending on your problem, there might be a lot of value using simulations can give you. And so they already incorporate sort of very realistic data. So if you look at video games like Grand Theft Auto, think that's the one most people are using. Even things like StarCraft or Warcraft, they already have, very good 3D rendering. They have objects inside of them. They have physics models. And so they incorporate a lot of things you'd want your model to learn about the real world. You have already the labels or the ground truth. You know exactly what the game engine is trying to show you. And you sort of have unlimited risk-free playability. And so, if you're trying to build a self-driving car algorithm, driving cars around Grand Theft Auto is fairly low risk or consequence. So when you're building your initial versions of the model, you can easily simulate millions and millions of hours of driving in Grand Theft Auto and sort of create situations for yourself without having any risk. And then, once your car drives perfectly in Grand Theft Auto, then you can try, in a parking lot or in closed areas and then move on to more complicated things, but that you don't risk destroying a car. It's just computational time. So there's actually a group in Darmstadt which sort of specializes in this. And so for these segmentation problems of trying to label all the pixels on the road, you can see that this is a incredibly tedious problem. So you have to go through a very high resolution image, and you have to label each point as being sort of road, car, sky, tree, traffic light. And so as you can imagine, this takes, can take hours per image to do. But if you use video games, you know exactly what the video game is trying to show you. So you know where the road is, you know where the trees are. And so you can actually get these images for free by hacking the video game to give you these results. And so that's quite an easy way to get a lot of data. Obviously, this isn't as realistic as real data. Some of these images do look a bit cartoonish, but it looks quite good, and the cost of acquiring lots of data is very low. And so at least as a starting point, you can get a lot of data quickly that way. You can also, I think this article has, this was an example from Apple, where they were training sort of eye tracking, I guess for something with their phone. I don't know exactly what they use it for, but where they were able to take Unity game engine, which has sort of models of human beings inside it, and you can make eyes, and you can make them do whatever you want. So you can have them blink, you can have them look around, look up, down, left, right, have big pupils, have small pupils, everything you want. And so they made data sets with thousands and thousands of images of eyes from the video games, and then used it to train models, sort of like these things we showed before, that turn video game eyes into real eyes. And so they were able to actually make thousands of video game eyes and make a model that used these video game eyes in order to recognize your eye tracking direction much better. Because just like, it's not quite as time consuming as the labeling of sort of Grand Theft Auto images, but taking an eye and determining exactly what the eye is looking at is not a particularly easy problem. You could try to find the center of the pupil, but then where is the center of the pupil supposed to be? Are they staring straight ahead? Are they looking left, looking right? You could probably make sort of very big categories, but it'd be very difficult for you to say exactly where that is. And with Unity, you know exactly where it is because you steered the eyeball in exactly that direction. And so there's lots of cases where simulation can give you a huge advantage if you have a problem that needs simulated data. Obviously, if you're doing something with synchrotron images, there's not really a good simulation system for getting synchrotron images. But for anything where video games or these 3D tools that exist work well, you can benefit massively from the ability to control them and make more data out of it. So in terms of data set problems, lots of issues that come up with data sets or algorithms in general are sort of these ideas of imbalance, too few examples, too homogeneous, and kind of lots of other problems that are similar to these. But these kind of cover most of the categories. Not enough edge cases, not enough really difficult images, not enough diversity. And sort of this comes up very frequently, usually not with the data sets, but usually with the algorithms that are built on top of it. And so in this example, this was the quite famous one from Google, where, someone looked at Google Photos and it classified their friends as gorillas. And, clearly they're not gorillas. It was just quite clear Google did not have a whole lot of black people in their training set. And so they trained models that when it saw that, it decided gorilla. And, it's a fairly, from a pixel perspective, probably the difference between the groups isn't that huge. But from a user perspective, to have your friends classified as gorillas, particularly in countries with problems with racism, that's a huge political no-go. And so you have to be aware that having diversity in your data sets is important in order to have algorithms that perform well on very diverse inputs. And so the solution from Google was to remove gorilla from the category. So now the algorithm doesn't predict gorillas at all anymore, which means it doesn't make that mistake. But that's sort of a pretty, simple solution to that problem. And one of the better solutions would be to sort of have training sets with more diverse people. And so this is one of the more popular data sets that exists, and sort of the celebrity A data set is what it's called. And, if you look at it, it's quite clear why it classified those people as gorillas, and it's because all the data they're training their models on are sort of, white people, more male than female, and, very, very narrowly sort of assessed. And so you end up having problems with models because your data set is fundamentally very imbalanced. And so if you then apply it to groups of people that it hasn't been trained on, then it doesn't work very well in the wild. And so, these are the sorts of problems that obviously have much more of an effect. In science projects, you're probably looking at data sets where you have too few examples of, lots of examples of normal, healthy specimens, very few examples of sick ones. Or, at the hospital, the opposite, where no one goes in the hospital if they're feeling healthy. And so you really don't know what normal looks like, because if they're in the hospital, sort of by definition, they must be there for some reason. And so you don't have a very good idea of what the normal population looks like. You only know the people who go to the hospital frequently. And so there have been efforts, the GDPR laws in Europe are forcing companies to be more responsible with how they build these algorithms and how they make these data sets. And IBM has come up with sort of a diverses face data set where they try to have faces that aren't just sort of white popular celebrities, but represent sort of a more worldwide valuable group. And that, with this digit distribution, you can kind of see you'd have the same sort of problem. If you only have digits, 1 through 3 and very few examples of what, 4, 5, and 6 looks like, you're going to have a huge problem making a model that works well for classifying 5 or 6 if most of your examples are just 1, 2, and 3. So now augmentation. So this is one of the more useful tools that you have. So collecting large data sets is very time consuming, very expensive. And, a lot of times, you can amplify the size of the data sets you have by sort of augmenting it. And so one of the easier things to do are these sort of standard transformations. And so you can take an image, shift it, zoom it, rotate it, change the intensity, change the scaling, change the color, and make more images from each image you have. That if you're doing a problem like classification, you wouldn't expect classes to change because you stretched or rotated the image just a little bit. And so, of course, what comes to this is you need to have, what transformations are normal for these images. That, is a flip a normal transformation. If you're building something that classifies digits, you would never expect to see a digit written backwards, or it would be a very weird thing to see. And so you probably wouldn't want to flip your digits upside down or left to right, because then it's a different shape. And so it probably doesn't make that much sense. Similarly, you wouldn't expect to see a digit rotated 90 degrees. And so you could rotate it a little bit, but you wouldn't expect that much diversity in it. And so how do you make sure the transformations match well? In hospitals, you don't have a CT image that's upside down. They're all taken the same way. And how much distortion is too much? Can you still recognize the image? Do you still see all the features that you need? So there's quite nice tools for doing this already, so you don't have to build any of this yourself. This is all available. So in Python with Keras, there's something called Image Data Generator, which allows you to perform all of these transformations just by giving sort of a small number to each one of them. And so you can decide which ones you do, and it's kind of a fairly simple setup where you just say which transformations you want to perform. And now you can take your MNIST data set and take an image like 5, and 5 gets scaled a little bit down. That made it a little bit thinner, gets shifted over a lot. It gets, I guess that one's almost the same as the original one, maybe rotated a little bit. 0, you have sort of the same sort of things happening to it. 4, you move it around and it's still always 4. And so here you see if you move it too much, it then probably becomes difficult to tell if that's a 4 or a 9. But that you can take each image you have and sort of get a lot more out of it by shifting it around and moving it. And so the tools work fairly well and give you a lot more data and confidence that if it works really well on all of these transformations, then it might or probably works really well in the real world as well. And so for CFAR10, which is another data set we didn't mention, but it's kind of a low resolution version of ImageNet, where you have images of sort of horses, cars, trucks, and I think any other categories? Some kind of animal. And that you can pull frogs. So 10 different categories. I don't remember exactly what they all are. But you have these and you can perform the augmentations there. And here you see very quickly you lose the contents of the image without too much shifting. So here you can tell it's a frog, but there you can't really tell it's a frog anymore. And so if this is the kind of augmentation you're performing, you're probably losing a lot of useful information by performing that. Here, having a horse rotated almost upside down makes it very difficult to identify that it's a horse. And so if you expected lots of upside down horses, maybe that would be a good augmentation to perform, but you probably don't. And so it's making it not more valuable, but probably less valuable. And so that's why it's always useful to kind of look at what you're actually producing by these transformations and decide sort of if you're, adding diversity and adding sort of more variety, or if you're just making your problem kind of unnecessarily harder. With the car as well, we see that, it's shifted and stretched so much that you really can't tell it's a car anymore. And so it's probably not a very useful transformation to perform. But with all of these things, you can go back also in the slides and change the parameters and see what effect it has on the data. And so baselines, this is sort of the last thing we'll talk about. And this is usually part of making a data set, is to kind of try to build the simplest, naivest model you can as sort of the worst case scenario. And so if you have a model that understands nothing about the data that you put in, what results do you get? And so you want a model that's obviously not intentionally wrong or doing things, worse than kind of random guessing, but you want one that has sort of some utility. And so, for example, if you have a model that's 99% accurate for predicting breast cancer, it's right here. Do I have breast cancer? Give me your age, weight, race. And it's no, because the incidence rate of breast cancer is 89 of 100,000 women. And so always saying no has a 99.91% accuracy. But it's completely useless. It's not a model. No one's helped by having that model tell them they never have breast cancer. And of course, for these 0.09% of women that actually have it, it's quite harmful to have this model tell them that they don't have it. And so for this, the baseline would be saying always no, and there would only be a model that was able to get more than 99.91% accuracy in order to have any value. And so particularly in medicine, you see a lot of these things where you have a breast cancer model that's able to get 95% accuracy, and you hear that number and think it's very good. But in reality, it's really, really bad because always saying no is 99.91. And so here, having a baseline and always comparing whatever you build to that baseline is quite important. And so here, your baseline would probably not even be that 0.09. It would probably be, if you're a woman, the expectation's slightly higher. If you're older, the sort of risk goes up. Weight, race obviously play a role as well. And so it'd be kind of incorporating the averages for those groups as your base prediction. And then saying, if you can build a model that's able to tell you something better than the average, then it's a useful model. The same sort of goes with, weather prediction, that the baseline isn't, 10 different categories for possible weather and you randomly guess. And so 10% is a good model. It's sort of saying the weather is the same tomorrow as it is today is your baseline. And you have to be better than saying that in order to have a model that's any valuable. And so luckily, in Python and lots of other, yeah?
So in general, you just take the biggest class as the baseline. So if you have the data and 50% of the time it's good weather, like sunny, whatever.
Yeah.
Then you have a bunch of other categories. But then the good weather, half of weather is the majority. Is that what you compare to?
So it's kind of tough. Yeah, so it's quite difficult to say what the baseline should be because there's a lot. So the baseline is supposed to be kind of the best really dumb model you can build. And so for some things, like the breast cancer, it's really taking the majority class. No, that would be sort of your starting point. But for like weather, because it's sunny 50% of the time, it's potentially still a better baseline to say it's the same as yesterday. Yeah. 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 So for that problem, so for classification, it's often taking the majority class. But even for other problems, so like with this, Mikai, the majority class of this image is not tumor. But still, your baseline model for this would probably be something like, I say that all pixels that are brighter than 200 are tumor. And so it's kind of a naive, simple model. It's not thinking, it's not processing, it's not really doing anything. But that for me, that would be kind of the baseline you'd compare against. So it's more complicated than just taking the majority class, but it's applying sort of a few simple rules. And your model should be anyone who builds something smart should be much better than whatever that baseline is. But it's about kind of establishing where's the floor. That if you aren't able to exceed that, you haven't done anything useful. And so if you say, for this one, if you were to just go with the majority class, they'd be like, look, I can identify bright pixels. I've built a great model. And you'd be like, well, no, the baseline's probably saying all bright pixels are cancer. And then you would compare any model someone gave you to that. And so for some problems, it gets a little bit more complicated. But yeah, so for like this one, in scikit-learn, which is one of the packages we'll use a bunch in sort of the Python part of this class, they have these sort of dummy classifiers. And so you have a classifier which basically just learns to guess the majority class. And so if you want to make a baseline for classification problem, you just use this. And sort of you have, whatever your input is. So we just have 0, 1, 2, 3, and then healthy, 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 cancer. And so if you make this dummy classifier and you put in, 1, 2, 3, 100, it just, I think we equals most frequent. So the initial strategies stratified, but it's actually better to use most frequent here. So if we use the majority class one, it basically then just says healthy no matter what we put in, because that was the most present class in our training data. And so scikit-learn actually wants you to always build these and have that as sort of your baseline so that you know your model's doing a better job than just predicting the most frequent category that shows up. The same thing with sort of, digits. So here we take the first 24 digits, 5, 0, 4, 1. The most common digit here is 1. I think we see 1, 4, 5 times in this data set, just by chance. And so if you build a classifier with the most frequent one here and predict for the digits 1 through 10, you just get 1 every time. And so it's not a very accurate model. It just says 1, but for those 5 digits, it happens to get it right. But it gives you some idea of what your kind of baseline performance could be. The next sort of step up from this, and this is the last machine learning method we'll cover for this class, for this lecture, is sort of nearest neighbor. And so this is then slightly more complicated than sort of the most frequent class. What this one does is it says, if you sort of look at your inputs that you used to train your model, or sort of your training set for it, and you find the closest match for the given point you put in to what you've already seen before. And so you just take a simple difference. And whichever one has the smallest simple difference is what you spit out as the result. And so this is a very simple method. There's no algorithms, no fancy filters or thinking going on. It's simply matching to what was the most similar image in your training set. And so here we take the same 24 images. We can then use k-neighbors classifier. We say we want to use just the closest one. And now we can predict on a few images and see that, for image 5, it predicted 5, 0, it predicted 0, 4, it predicted 4, 1, it predicted 1. And so it actually looks like it worked perfectly here. Does anyone know why? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we used images 1 through 24 to train it, and then we applied this to images 1 through 24. And so all it's saying is this is a verification that the model worked well, that it was able to say, I've seen this image before, and it was a 5 when I saw it before, so it's still a 5. And so here it gets every single one of them correct, but it actually doesn't really tell us much. So here our baseline isn't 100% because you're not supposed to use the same group to kind of train and evaluate your model. And that's again something we'll get into later. But, it's just using, this nearest neighbor is a very nice baseline because if you do train with the same data set, you'll get 100%. And of course, you can't do better than 100%. And so you don't really have an algorithm problem to solve. And so now if we start at image 25, we now see that it still works much better than the most common class one. It gets this 3 right, and it, guesses things that aren't ridiculous, but it's not perfect anymore. And so here it, guesses 1 when it's actually 4, but it's a very thin 4, so it's easy to see why it would guess 1. Here it's a 7, but it actually thought it was a 1, but that's actually a fairly easy to understand mistake, a 7 that it thought was a 2. So it's not a great model, but it's sort of giving us an idea for what sort of a baseline performance would be. So it's not random guessing, but it's certainly not intelligent. And so that's sort of the goals for the baseline models, is that we want to have things that are able to show us kind of what is the one step better than random guessing giving you as a result. And this is then quite important because if you're building complicated models, you want to show that your complicated model actually does a better job than this. And these often do very, very well. And so if you're not doing better than this, your complicated model isn't really adding a lot of value to what you're doing. And so if you want to look at things like how good is good, we have a number of different approaches for doing that. The simplest one is just accuracy. So how many of them did you get correct? And then we have sort of confusion matrix, which are which classes did you most frequently confuse? And so here we can show that over all the digits. And we can see that sort of, for 7, when the real value was 7, we very frequently said it was 1 and 7. And so this table kind of lets you see which ones did you do well on. So the diagonal is sort of when your predictions matched what they should have been, and everything off diagonal is when they didn't match. And we can also see that 4 and 9 got confused a lot. 1 it didn't get confused with as many things, but here you can also start to identify where the biggest problems occur. And so if you were to build, you could start taking this and say, if I need to improve my model, it needs to do a better job of distinguishing 1 and 7, because that's where it has the biggest problem. Rather than collecting more examples of, 3, where it doesn't really confuse 3 very often at all. And so getting more examples of 3s doesn't really help you improve your data set. It's only helpful to get sort of the tricky digits that your algorithm's performing really poorly on. And so this just lets you sort of visualize what are you doing well, what are you not doing well, and also for your baseline that when you're building things or better algorithms on top of it, that you have something that you can kind of reference for comparison. Okay. So for the exercises with this lecture, for the Python ones, it'll be just kind of going through these slides and playing with the augmentation settings and kind of getting a little bit comfortable with the tools. There's also references to notebooks, but there's nothing specific to do for exercises. For 9, there's then some workflows you can download where you do image augmentation in 9, but it's again more just exploratory, and the sort of real exercises start next week when we dive into image enhancement. So there, they'll cover specific techniques, specific problems, but this is sort of the basis for feeling comfortable with that. In addition to that, we now have sort of the first projects up, and the list will sort of be expanded. But if you go down to projects, hopefully it's, yeah, so there's the projects page. Kind of the important part, zoom in more, is that it's sort of scientifically driven and that there's a very clear question. So like, what are you trying to solve? What are you doing? So very similar to what we talked about with sort of the data sets, that it's not, count the number of bubbles in the system. That's not a project. The project has to be sort of, does temperature affect bubble size? And of course, to do that, you'll need to count the bubbles. You'll need to measure the bubbles. You'll have some sort of statistical analysis. But your project should be much more along the lines of sort of a real scientific question. The challenge for it will be to take your images through the appropriate processing steps, sort of characterize, what steps you took, why you took them, what parameters you looked at, how did you decide which parameters worked best, what might be the sources for errors and how did that happen, and then give sort of a very short presentation, so sort of 5 to 10 minutes, and sort of show what you did, present some of your results, and then sort of discuss with students and myself about what sort of could be done differently or what you would like to have tried or what approaches didn't work well that surprised you, and sort of explain that. And so it's really not meant to be like a giant presentation, really a small, short, quick, this is what we did, this is how we did it, and these are the results, and just to get kind of feedback. But the goal is to do something where it's actually an interesting project for you and you care about the results of the data. And so, if you're a PhD student, it should be fairly easy. You have lots of data that you need to analyze anyways. If you're a master's student, maybe you have less. And so we have a number of projects here. And then, as I mentioned, there's all the data sets on Kaggle and tons of new challenges on Kaggle, sort of every week or month. Or the Grand Challenges website where, if you did a really good job, you could actually win money or publish at conferences. So there's plenty of opportunities to find data sets to try to analyze. So here we just mention a few examples of them, where you're looking for what kind of whale it is from the image, how much blood is being ejected from a heart from sort of a time series of MRI images, how are brains connected, and then sort of simpler ones like, what digit is available, how can you identify digits inside of a much larger data set, or street numbers inside of a picture of a house. And so there's plenty of options there. If you go to the link, you'll be brought to a form where you can see what projects people did before, and there will be a sign-up page for projects this year. You can also then come and ask me if you have any questions, but you can kind of see what people have done before and what people are interested in. It's not mandatory, but it's sort of strongly encouraged. I think it makes the course a lot more useful and helpful if you have a project, and kind of gives you a focus for what parts of the course you really want to pay attention to. And so, yeah, you can go through all the other years and what people did projects on, and you can see that they range from sort of, the breast mammography example that we had before to, moisture uptake in paintings, canvases, and bubble migration in ice, all sorts of different projects. And so, probably you have lots of your own ideas, and if you need help or input, you can talk to myself or Amoga with your questions. So, okay, so that's it. So you can feel free to work on the exercises or ask questions.